Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Careers in a Crunch. I'm Arthi, and today I'm joined by Brooke Lea Foster, who's an author and journalist. I'm super excited to have her on my podcast and hear about her professional journey. I just want to thank you for being here. I'm super excited to have you on my podcast.
Oh my gosh, I'm so excited to be here. And this is like so fun because I think you're the youngest person to ever interview me. So this is going to be so fun for me. I love it.
I'm so glad. So, I guess we can just dive right into a few questions.
Sure.
So, my first one is, what did you major in, and how did that have an impact on your career, if it did at all?
Okay, so I went to University of Maryland College Park, which I absolutely loved. It was the right school for me. And I was an English major. And English at Maryland, so Maryland has 46,000 or so kids. It's a really big school, but the English department was really small. So I only had, say, 20 kids per class. So it was wonderful. I was really able to connect with my teachers and the books and really get a good sense of what it meant to be a good reader, a critical thinker, and a writer. I started out as a journalism major. That was what I entered the university with. But as I was on campus and kind of daydreaming, I decided that I wasn't sure that you could learn to be a journalist as much as you needed to go out in the world and just work as a journalist. So I decided that learning the great books, and honestly, I was such a nerd. I was like, I'm going to learn the great books, and just learning kind of what it took to make a good story would help me as a writer. I wasn't always certain I wanted to be a writer. I was the editor-in-chief of my high school newspaper, so that was certainly the track I was in high school. But as I started getting more involved in college, I got more involved in leadership, and I was worked with this wonderful group of mentors at the Academy of Leadership, which was all about women, developing the next generation of women political leaders. And so I ended up actually applying to law school after college, and I really thought I wanted to go to law school. And when I got in and I was all set to go, and then I worked at a law firm that first summer after I graduated from college, and I hated it so much. And the lawyers there were all they were warning me like you'll never I said, "Oh, I want to do nonprofit law. I want to be an advocate for children. I want to work for the Children's Defense Fund in DC." And they were like, "The amount of debt you'll take on in law, you have to work in private practice." And so anyway, I was weighing that and ultimately sat down with a list of all of the magazines and newspapers in Washington, D.C., which is where I wanted to live, and just cold called them and ended up with my first job in journalism.
That that's just a great story. I mean, I love how, like you said, you were the editor-in-chief of your high school newspaper. So that right there sort of like you were kind of saying was the beginning of like the journey and then how you sort of transitioned to law. But I mean, in the end, you ended up as an author, and I think it was an incredible journey that you went on. And I mean, you had like sort of two different paths, one, but then you kind of ended up back at sort of the beginning
Yeah.
as an
I mean, I
author.
think that happens sometimes as you're figuring things out. I was very creative in high school in terms of writing, but I never wrote fiction. I always was very interested in journalism. I loved interviewing people. It's so fun, right? You get to ask people anything. And I just thought that was the most amazing thing that people love to talk about themselves. So if you just sit down and ask them questions, they'll just chit chit chat. So I love that. And so once I got into law and, worked at the firm and realized just how much of that creative side I would have to let go of, it just didn't feel true to who I was. And it was a hard decision to make. I feel like law school is for any type A overachieving personality, law school is a very natural fit because when you graduate from college, similar to when you graduate from high school, everyone says, "What are you going to do?" And when you don't have an answer, it can be very scary. But if you can say, "I'm going to law school," you feel very organized, you feel like you're on the right path. And so it felt really good to be able to say that. And so when I sent in my deferment letter, um, to law school, I thought, oh, I'll take a year off and figure things out. But really, I knew deep down it was just a way to put off the inevitable. I just wasn't quite ready to say I wasn't going to go ever. But it was really the bold choice, the courageous choice. And I'm so grateful every day that I did that because if I had gone to law school, I would have been a terrible lawyer.
I think that's great that you knew what was right for you. And I mean, it's a difficult decision to make. I think in general, those kind of decisions that could, especially the ones that are going to decide your future potentially, it can be really scary. Um, but I think having the ability to kind of decide what's right for you and like make that choice, I think it's great. And you ended up in an amazing spot where you do something that you love. So I think that's just great.
Yeah, thank you. Thank
Yeah,
you.
of course. What first inspired you to become a writer? And was there a particular moment when you sort of realized that this was the path you wanted to pursue?
Yeah, so it's funny because I sort of divide my life up into my years as a nonfiction writer and journalist and my years as a fiction writer. So when it comes to writing, being a journalist, I got a job at Washingtonian Magazine in DC, which was the city magazine down there. So it's very similar to Los Angeles Magazine, New York Magazine, Boston Magazine. And I got a job as the assistant to the editor in chief, but I was called assistant editor, so I sounded much more important than I really was. So when I sat down with the editor, he was like, silver hair, and he was much older than me. He came from a different generation of like investigative reporters, but he was very kind and very interested in mentoring the next generation of journalists. And I sat down with him and he said, look, 50% of your job is going to be, you know, he didn't have me fetch coffee, but like, gathering meetings, organizing the birthday parties for the staff. I mean, stuff like you don't dream of doing when you go to college, right? Like it was just like whatever. I was assisting him. The other 50% of your job is whatever you make of it. So if you want to write, you can try writing. If you want to do public relations, you can do public relations. Well, this was a dream scenario at age 22 because of course, I wanted to be a writer. And I wanted to write for the magazine. I wanted my byline in the magazine. And so I just started pitching stories to him and my other editors on staff. And within a year, I was a staff writer and, kind of moved up the ladder from there. So, what inspired me, I think it was when I started interviewing people for articles and spending time, one on one, really delving into what people were going through. I've done so many articles for everything from profiling congressional leaders to writing about Washington's most beautiful people, like a People magazine piece, to the a winning deaf football team at Gallaudet University, to a kid genius who was 9 years old and a junior in college, and her mother was dying of breast cancer. Like, I've just run the gamut of what I've written about. And I just loved it. I loved being able to parachute into all these different people's worlds and to sit down with them and just find out who they were and what made them tick and, what inspired them. And, all these questions you're sort of asking me. Like, I love talking to people about their lives. And I loved kind of getting into the deeper parts of what someone was feeling or thinking that we don't really get day to day on the surface. When we just say, "How are you?" "I'm fine." "How are you?" "I'm great." You don't get to really dig in. And so I love that. And after 20 years of being a reporter and writing long, I would write like these 5,000, 6,000 word narrative articles, creative nonfiction articles. I just felt like I'd had my second baby. Emerson was, she's my little one, and she was 6 months old. And I just started feeling like I could write an article in my sleep. It was very routine. I knew the formula. There was like a good anecdote, the quote, the hook quote. We called it a nut graph in journalism, where you wrote like sort of what's the point. of this article real fast. And it just became, pretty habitual for me. And so I wanted to flex a new muscle in writing. And I'd always dreamed of being a fiction writer. Like being a fiction writer was something I never thought I could do. I would go into bookstores and just run my hand along the tops of fiction covers. Like I'm not even exaggerating and just be like, oh, the people who get to write novels, it just seemed like they were magical, those people. Um, and when Emerson was 6 months old, I was like, you know what? I have this idea and I feel like I should give it a shot. And so I sat down and started writing it. And like I am now publishing my fifth book next summer. So, I think what inspired me to move into fiction was just this desire to grow and evolve in my career and also follow sort of my next dream, which was fiction. It had been for so long.
Yeah, that's incredible. And I think journalism is incredible. I think there's so many things that you can learn from journalism. Like people skills is, I think, one of the most valuable skills that any person could have. And especially kind of like you were saying, getting to talk to someone on a more deeper level rather than surface level kind of allows you, like that itself allows you to grow as a person and kind of just helps you and can get you further in life. But like you were saying, like also knowing that you could try something else because that could also be something else that could work for you, and like you, for you that that meant writing fiction and becoming a fiction author. And I think that is amazing. I mean, being able to write a book is, and let alone this is going to be your fifth one, is amazing, and that's just such an achievement.
Oh, thank you so much. I mean, to be honest with you, excuse me. Um, I feel like there are certain times in life where you hit upon something that just you love so much. And with writing, I never thought that that was mine. I really didn't. I just thought, oh, that's a hobby. But as I got older and I've gotten more connected to stories and what they've meant for me in my life, I just, writing is all I know how to do. Like I joke all the time with friends. It's like, you guys can like go out and like run a company. Like I can write. Like that's what I can do. And that's what I love to do. And so the more that people, your listeners who are fine, trying to figure things out, the more you can tap into what makes you really tick, not what looks good to other people, not what's going to impress people. It's what feels good to you to sit down and do every day, that because ultimately it's you in a room and a computer doing this thing. So whatever that is in your life, you have to love it.
Yeah, I think that is like kind of really important. I mean, passion is the basis of everything. If you're not
Yeah.
doing something you love, you're not going to be willing to put in, right, 100% every day, right, for the next who knows how long. But when you really love something and you can like talk about writing and like talk about how much you love it, like it really like shows. And that, I mean, that's the best work is done when it's you're doing something you love. So, yeah.
Yeah, totally. Totally. I mean, there's a lot of more practical people than me who would say, well, but you have to be able to pay your rent and I get it, but there's always ways to do what you love, even if it's the harder road.
Yeah. What skills from journalism have helped you when you started writing fiction and are still writing fiction?
So I would say that when you're writing um, a journalistic article and profiling someone in particular with a profile, you are in many ways building a character. You're just taking facts and you're using those facts to shape the person you're writing about on paper. But it's all true, right? But I was still trying to figure out, like, how the way someone spoke made them who they were, what their background said about them, what they were saying and what they were not saying, what their quotes were saying on the surface, but who they really were. So all of that played into when I became a fiction writer because I was already so fascinated by character and people. And so now I had this really fun job of where I got to make everything up. So rather than sitting there and waiting for the great quote, I could just write the great quote. I didn't have to, mine someone's personality. I was suddenly building the personality. So it was really great fun, and it was quite freeing as a writer to not have to sit there kind of digging and mining through someone's personality and just kind of shaping it on my own. I'll also say, because I didn't write front page, New York Times quick stories, what I wrote was long creative nonfiction articles. I already was writing stories that had a beginning, a middle, and an end. They had arcs, where the person typically went through some kind of change by the end of the story, or there was a shift in the plot, even if it was nonfiction. So I was just sort of already training to write fiction without even realizing it. And so when I sat down to write the first draft of my first book, Summer Darlings, I just wrote the way I wrote nonfiction. I just would sit there and I just kind of like wrote what I knew. And I didn't worry that it was a mess. I didn't worry that it probably was unreadable to most people. I was just like, I'm going to get it down on paper and then I'm going to do what I did in journalism, which is then I'm going to revise it. And so it was actually the best way to write because I think a lot of times when people write fiction, from what I've seen years later, looking back, is that people put up roadblocks as they write and they kind of try to perfect their sentences. And writing a novel is the long game. It's 85, 90,000 words. That is a lot of words. And if you sit there researching and stopping to make one beautiful sentence, it could take you 10 years. I mean, I just don't write that way. I write fast and I write dirty and messy and I'm like, okay, we'll go back and we'll fix it. The other thing that really helped me is that because in journalism you get edited so much and you revise so much, when I gave my first draft to other people to read and they told me things were wrong with it, I didn't take it personally. So another roadblock that hits beginning writers is that they feel criticized. They feel it's so close to their heart, fiction, so people can feel like, oh, there's no point in even writing. I can't write. They sort of can beat themselves up. No, I didn't do that. I just said, this is a way to make it better. So let me hear what people are saying. Let me look for the patterns and then go in and fix it. Um, I'm trying to think of what else connects it. I think those are the big ones. But I do think that journalists make really good fiction writers for this reason because we don't take edits personally. Like I've heard from my editors over the years that they love working with journalists because sometimes literary fiction writers can get very upset if one of their sentences are cut or changed. But to me, it's all about the larger story, which is just like how my articles were. It's like, let's get this right. And let's make sure it's clear and it's concise and we're not like overwriting. So I write very clean and I would say my books are very character driven, just like my articles really were.
Yeah, I really like the way that you sort of put it that like interviewing someone is right, you sort of get to know their life story, and with that, you get to create, as a journalist, you get to create a character for them, and you kind of get to talk about them and kind of create a voice for them and all these things that are obviously very helpful to being a fiction writer. Um, but like you were saying, there's a lot of like creative freedom when being a fiction writer because everything is sort of coming from you and you can kind of shape anything like the way you want it and the way that you kind of plan on doing it and like your thoughts and things like that. And also what you were talking about with criticism, criticism is definitely something that a lot of people take it more personally, but when you kind of focus on the bigger picture and not really worry about like the super small details or a sentence or that, it can like move faster and
Hmm.
it can like you were saying like books can come out like quicker rather than people who sort of focus on like every tiny thing every step of the way.
Yeah. I mean, it's so easy to put roadblocks up in writing because there's so many other things you could be doing. So you can find excuses to walk away from the computer quite often. And when you write, I write historical fiction, so there's a lot of research involved in the other time periods. And my historical fiction friends and I always talk about how easy it is to go down the rabbit hole of just like researching a certain year and like what it can be such a funny detail, but like what hand soap they would be using. And it's really two words in your whole book, but you end up starting to read about Brillo and like it's just you can get so lost. So you have to really be good at writing almost on a deadline. And that's something else I took from journalism is I really treat my day my as a work day, even though I'm home. So I work from home. I go to the gym in the morning. I walk the dogs. Obviously the kids are at school, and then I immediately sit down and write. And I try to write pretty consistently until lunchtime. Then I take a break, and then I write through the afternoon. So I think with writing fiction too, it's easy to not think to treat it as a hobby. But if you want to make it a career, you have to treat it as a full-time job. And that's
Hmm.
exactly what I've done.
Yeah, I think like being an author, and honestly, a lot of other jobs as well. If you want something to happen, you have to put the work in.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
right, this goes for literally anything, right? You have to give it your best in order to like have the best outcome, right? And like you were saying, I guess for authors, a lot of times they might they as they put like challenges and they kind of face a lot of things, it's easy to get frustrated and just
Hmm.
take steps back and walk away. But to just be able to just focus and sit and write, I think that's a great skill.
I know. And we joke in fiction writing, it's called butt in chair. Like literally get your butt in the chair. Like if you want to write a book, you just have to sit down and start writing. Like that's it.
Yes. What's the hardest part about writing a novel? Would it be like starting it, finishing, revising, or like anything else?
That's such a good question. So I think that after writing 5 books, what's hard is that it never gets easier. So, with when I was telling you earlier that with journalism, I sort of could get to this formulaic way of writing where you just sort of knew where everything was going to go. Every book is different. And that's hard because you kind of want to believe every time I believe this myth, every time I begin, like this is just going to come out of me. But it doesn't. Like you have to work for these words and you have to really sit alone quite a bit and make sense of these people's lives who you've decided to highlight in this book. And I find that, pretty challenging. I think it's also hard to begin because when I usually have a sense, so some writers sit down with an entire outline and then start to write. And that makes them feel more organized because they can say, okay, now I'm on chapter 2. What's chapter 2 again? And they have a couple of sentences about chapter 2. I've tried to create an outline before writing a book, and I've found that as soon as I start writing, I throw the outline away because none of it makes sense once I start writing because the book takes you in so many different directions. Um, so I forgot where I was going with that. What was hard? Oh, right, the beginnings. So what I found is that just sitting with that blank page in the beginning and then finishing and saying, well, what happens next? Like getting that first draft down is honestly brutal. But once I get that draft, I celebrate because I love revision. Revision to me is a dream. Once I have words to work with, then I can go in, I can work on character, I can shape the voice. Then I have a sense of where the book is going. It's just that brutal beginning is so hard and so challenging. And some authors are different. When I go on panels and speak with other writers, it's so funny because some people hate revision and they love the first draft because they feel like they can just dream and make anything happen. And revision is the nuts and bolts. But I think that's why I love revision because that's where the magic happens. There's just so many times where I'm writing fiction and I don't plan on a certain conversation to happen. And then all of a sudden, my characters are having this very poignant, very plot essential conversation that even surprises me. And I'll lift my fingers off the keyboard and just chuckle because I'll think, wow, like where did that come from? You know, there was this part in my last book where the two sisters are in Nantucket and they're in this hotel room and they're sort of having this come to Jesus moment about their family. And the one sister, the youngest sister, has been hiding all along that she's pregnant. And she says to her sister, um, she admits it. She's like, I'm pregnant. And her sister says, I know. And I just like that I know just came from Magic Land. And when it happened, I just started laughing because I'm like, of course she knew. She's her sister. Like she's pretending this whole time she doesn't know, but everybody knows. Like you know your sister. So it was just like it may sound small, but for a writer, there's so many fun little twists that happen as you're writing where the characters start to reveal themselves to you and their dialogue, shows you a piece of who they are that just makes you feel so excited because the story's really coming alive at that moment.
That that is so cool. And the beginning, to me, honestly, that also sounds like the most challenging part. I mean, I don't even think I can imagine me like writing a book. Um, but like the beginning, uh, I mean, just like even writing like essays at school, which is not nearly right the same size, but I
But
mean,
still a lot.
even it's like it's very hard to just like think of ideas like on the spot, like just from your head and or like whatever information you have. You just kind of have to like do it, and you do have to sit there and you have to like think through it. It takes like a lot of time and effort, and you really just have to like kind of put the time in because I think revision is sort of the easiest part to be able to just you can work with what you have already and just kind of change it, add things, maybe take some stuff out. But I
Yep.
mean, yeah.
Totally. Totally. Yeah. I mean, I had an editor once who, whenever I was struggling to begin one of my articles, he would say, come in and sit down and tell me what the story's about. And I would just start talking. And as I would start talking, we'd realize what parts of it were most interesting. And then he would say to me, okay, go sit and write that part. And it was so much easier. So I think sometimes when we put so much stock into those first few lines, we can really freeze ourselves in writing, even when we're writing essays. And so I always tell my kids, just start writing. Just start writing what comes to mind. So if what comes to mind is the soldier walked into the house, just start there. You can go back and delete that later, but that line's going to get you to the second line and the third line. And so you're right. You have to sometimes just sit there and begin and not worry with how poignant or important or essential that first line sounds, because often that line disappears once you're really
Hmm.
getting into the meat of your essay.
Yeah. Sort of going into advice, if you could go back and give your high school self one piece of advice, what would it be?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think I would say don't be afraid to change your mind. I think it's really, I don't know. I think like I did change my mind multiple times because as I said, I changed my major and I changed, from into law and then back to journalism. But I think that I made those decisions so much harder than they needed to be because I was always afraid I was going to disappoint the people that loved me. And I think that I started to define myself in certain ways as an achiever to my parents. And when I switched, I would always think, oh, they're not going to like that or they're going to be disappointed. And they never were. They never were. They were always so supportive and so curious and interested in what I was doing. And so I guess I would say to myself, don't be afraid because you're not going to disappoint anyone. Go after what you want and what you're dreaming about because in the end, all everybody around you wants is for you to be happy.
Yeah, that I think that is an amazing piece of advice. I think doing what you love is just it can get you like already, I think, so far in life, and having like the passion for something. But I think, like you were saying, being afraid to sort of change around things because you're sort of afraid of what other people are going to think, it definitely is something that I think, right, a lot of people can feel, right? You don't want to disappoint people, and they might think differently of you or things like that. But I think in reality, I think everybody is going to be happy, right? The people that love you will always support you and be there and show up for you. So I think that's a great piece of advice.
Yeah, thank you. And I also would say, you just made me think of something else. I think in high school, it was different times. So it wasn't the same chase to success that I think all you guys live with this pressure. But I will say that I definitely had this sense that because I didn't go to an Ivy League school, I may not be as successful or as smart as some of my other peers. And what I realized quickly in my 20s is that it had nothing to do with where I went to school. It had everything to do with how much work I put in and really how determined I was.
Hmm.
Because in the end, I had tons of people, coworkers who say went to Harvard or went to Yale and all these places that were taught to worship coming up through high school, but they would sort of fall off and do something else, or maybe they didn't enjoy journalism or whatever, or maybe I just happened to rise up at a moment they were, we were just all there together. And ultimately, I sort of let that get in my head a little bit too much in my 20s, and I would even be a little intimidated by some of those people. And I just realized in the end, we're all just put our pants on the same way. We're all
Hmm.
just trying to live our best life. We're all just like trying to have fun at the end of the day. And so, oh, sorry, my dog's barking. So, yeah, so I would also say that to myself, like, don't get caught up in the nonsense. Like,
Hmm.
you are just as smart and just as deserving of your place wherever you are,
Yeah,
as the
I
next person.
100% agree. I think that's also something that I agree with, and I think it's something important for a lot of students to hear too, which sort of goes into my next question and my last question, which is, what advice would you give to high school students who are still unsure about what they want to do?
Oh my goodness. I'm so glad you asked me this question because this is what I tell my own high school student all the time. You shouldn't know what you want to do. It is such a silly notion that at 15, 16, 17, you should have your life planned out. And you know what? If you do, fabulous, but be willing to change and evolve because the truth is, you the world is such a big place and there's so much to learn and there's so much exciting travels in your future and people to meet and relationships to nurture. And what you love, you shouldn't know what that is yet. If I really want to like drive that point home, there's so much pressure for you guys to know so young, but explore. Take classes in every subject you can. Try internships in many different fields. This idea that you pick one thing and you only do that thing is so narrow-minded. And I think in this new economy that we're all gonna, this big shift as AI comes into our lives even more, we are going to need very creative thinkers. We're going to need people who can pull a little bit from lots of different disciplines to do the work they do. So I think being that narrow-minded and focused is actually going to close you off to some of the successes out there. So yeah, I would say try everything, meet everyone, go everywhere. Don't put yourself in a box
Hmm.
because then your life will get smaller and your life can be so big. So go out there and find it.
Yeah, that is a wonderful piece of advice, and I think that when you sort of already make up your mind and you decide exactly what you want to do, it can sort of put you in a position where you're not going to get as many opportunities as someone who is open-minded and someone who is willing to try so many different things and willing to go down a windy path rather than sort of a straight path.
Yeah.
Because I mean, in reality, I've talked to like a lot of people, and no one's path is just perfect. There are
Yeah.
so many different sort of turns and twists, and different like things that make it their path and make it special and make them who they are today. And I think that's something that a lot of high school students specifically right now would benefit from hearing. So,
I think so
yeah.
too. That's why I think this project of yours is so important because it's wonderful for you and it's wonderful for your listeners because, it's true. No one wakes up and says, I want to be an ad executive and then becomes an ad executive, right? Like it's like
Hmm.
there's many twists and turns that get us there. And that's what
Yes.
makes life fun. That's what makes it joyful. It's all those opportunities that present themselves that we either take or don't.
Yeah,
So.
100%. And I want to thank you. This was an incredible interview. I learned so much, and it was amazing to hear your journey. So thank you so much for allowing me to do this.
Oh my gosh, I'm so happy to be here and I'm so excited to see where your journey ends up.
That's it for this episode of Careers in a Crunch. If you found today's conversation helpful and informative, be sure to share with a friend or family member. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an interview. Thanks. Bye.